The elevator doors at the Harrington Club didn't just open onto the 47th floor. They released pressure, the way an airlock does before something irreversible happens on the other side. It was a Thursday evening in late October, and Chicago was doing what Chicago does best in autumn, punishing the unprepared. The wind off Lake Michigan had been cutting through the canyon streets since noon, rattling the floor-to-ceiling glass panels of the Penthouse conference suite, where Apex Venture Capital was hosting the most important dinner of its fiscal year. $412 million in committed capital sat on the table, structured around a wellness and fitness technology merger that Garrett Holt had been engineering for the better part of 18 months. Garrett Holt was not a man who tolerated imprecision. He was 61 years old, silver-haired, and carried himself with the particular stillness of someone who had spent decades deciding which businesses would survive and which would be quietly dismembered for parts. He had built Apex into one of the most feared venture capital firms in the country, not through brilliance necessarily, but through an absolute refusal to be wrong in public. Tonight, the Penthouse suite had been arranged like a military briefing room. Term sheets, acquisition frameworks, and actuarial projections fanned across a long mahogany table. Bottles of a single malt Scotch whiskey, aged 25 years, sat uncorked and breathing near the center. 3 international investors had flown in specifically for this dinner. A Canadian pension fund director named Raymond Caulfield, a South Korean infrastructure billionaire named David Marlowe, who operated entirely through his Chicago-based office, and a silent Australian co-investor, whose name appeared on exactly 2 documents in the room and nowhere else. He was listed only as C. Harrow. But before the investors arrived, before the catering staff from the hotel's private dining service had finished arranging the crystal, there was a moment in the service corridor on the 47th floor that nobody on the executive team noticed. A man stepped off the staff elevator at 5:47 p.m., 15 minutes before guests were due. He was tall, considerably taller than the corridor seemed designed to accommodate, wearing a faded olive canvas jacket over a plain gray shirt, dark jeans with a small tear at the left knee, and boots that had clearly walked a significant number of miles on surfaces that were not polished marble. He carried nothing except a worn leather notebook and a takeaway coffee from the cafe 3 blocks south. The catering supervisor, a woman named Nadia Reeves, who was 29 years old and had spent 2 years managing private event logistics, spotted him immediately. Her instinct was to redirect him. The staff entrance was on the south side, and lost contractors ended up in the prep area at least twice this week. She started toward him with the polite, efficient smile she used for redirections. Then she stopped. It wasn't anything dramatic. It was a small thing. The man had paused near the glass partition separating the corridor from the main conference suite. He wasn't looking at the room itself. He was looking at the structural joints where the glass panels met the steel frame, the particular intersection where the building's ventilation system created a barely perceptible draft. He placed one hand flat against the lower panel, held it there for exactly 1 breath, then nodded very slightly to himself, as if something he had suspected had just been confirmed. Nadia had no idea what he was checking, but the gesture did not belong to a lost contractor. It belonged to someone who had built things or studied them, or both. She redirected him anyway. He thanked her with a short, easy smile, the kind that didn't require anything in return, and turned toward the main entrance. Nadia went back to her clipboard, but she watched the door after he went through it. His name appeared on the guest list as C. Harrow, Australian co-investor. The entry had been confirmed by Apex's managing director, Marcus Dray, and that was the extent of what anyone on staff knew. What Marcus knew, what the Apex legal team had told him 6 weeks earlier, was that C. Harrow represented a significant passive co-investment position held through a series of Australian holding companies. The identity of the individual behind those entities was, as the legal team put it, client confidential and not relevant to the operational structure of the evening. Marcus Dray had taken this to mean, don't ask, don't investigate, seat him at the far end of the table. Marcus Dre was 44, impeccably turned out in a charcoal suit that cost more than the average American's monthly rent, and possessed of the specific brand of social cruelty that masquerades as high standards. He was Garrett Holt's primary enforcer, the man who made the difficult calls, delivered the uncomfortable messages, and managed the room so Holt could remain above the fray. He had a gift for identifying weakness and a complete inability to distinguish between weakness and something that simply didn't look the way he expected. He clocked C. Harrow the moment the man walked in, the boots, the jacket, the absence of a tie or a watch or any of the visible markers that told Marcus Dre he was dealing with someone worth his time. He made a calculation in approximately 3 seconds. The calculation was wrong in every particular, but he would not discover that for another 2.5 hours. "Mr. Harrow," Marcus said, with the precise calibration of warmth that means nothing. "Welcome. I'm Marcus Dre, managing director at Apex. Can I get someone to take that jacket for you?" The man looked at him with quiet, dark eyes, the kind that take in the whole room before settling on a single point. "I'm fine," he said. The accent was Australian, distinctly so, but with none of the performing quality some people acquire after years in rooms like this one. It was simply how he spoke. "Of course." Marcus gestured toward the far end of the table, well away from Holt and the 3 primary investors in the position traditionally occupied by observers, note-takers, and people whose opinions the room had not yet decided it needed. C. Harrow looked at the seat. Then he looked back at Marcus. He didn't argue. He sat down, placed his leather notebook on the table, and accepted a glass of Scotch from the catering staff with a brief thank you that the server actually heard. Nadia Reeves, stationed near the service panel on the east wall, watched this. She watched the way C. Harrow's eyes moved around the room as the investors settled in, not nervously, not with the aggressive assessment of someone proving themselves, but with a particular quality of patient attention she associated, without quite knowing why, with people who already know how a thing is going to end. The dinner began at 7. By 7:20, it was already going wrong. Garrett Holt was presenting the core thesis of the merger, a consolidation of 3 mid-tier fitness technology companies into a single integrated wellness platform targeting the premium health market across North America and the Asia-Pacific region. The thesis was sound as far as it went. The problem was execution. Holt's presentation assumed a level of operational understanding about the wellness industry that his audience didn't share, and instead of adjusting for this, he was accelerating, piling density on top of density, assuming the numbers would carry the room. Raymond Caulfield was the first to show strain. He was a methodical man who made decisions slowly and documented his reasoning at every stage. He had stopped nodding somewhere around the point where Holt moved from market size projections to user retention modeling without pausing to establish why retention was the critical metric in the first place. David Marlowe had said nothing at all since sitting down. He was watching Holt with an expression of absolute neutrality, which in Nadia's experience meant either deep agreement or deep skepticism. She had not yet determined which. From the far end of the table, C. Harrow had not moved. His notebook was open, but he had written nothing. He held the Scotch glass loosely, occasionally tilting it to observe the color of the spirit in the light. Once, very briefly, he glanced at the actuarial projection on the document in front of him, flipped to page 11, paused on a figure, then turned back to page 3. The whole sequence took 45 seconds. Nadia saw it. She didn't know what it meant, but something about it made her stay close to the east wall. Then Marcus Dre stood up. He tended to do this when he sensed the room needed redirecting, and began supplementing Holt's presentation with the kind of confident assertions that sound like facts until you examine them closely. The critical differentiator, Marcus said, is that the premium fitness consumer in the 25 to 45 demographic has demonstrated a consistent willingness to pay a 40% price premium for integrated data experiences. The science on this is settled. Raymond Caulfield looked up. Could you point me to a specific study? The 40% figure. Marcus smiled the smile of a man who has never needed to provide a source. It's the composite of several longitudinal datasets. I can have our research team send the full bibliography tomorrow. From the end of the table, very quietly, C. Harrow said, "The figure is closer to 26%, and it's not stable across age cohorts." The table went still. Marcus turned toward the far end. He had not expected the observer to speak, and the tone, not confrontational, simply accurate, caught him without a prepared response. "I'm sorry, Mr. Harrow, are you referencing a specific dataset? The Australian Institute of Sport Consumer Behavior Study from 2022, cross-referenced with the Johns Hopkins Center for Health Behavior Research from 2023. C. Harrow turned a page in his notebook. The premium willingness to pay is robust in the 25 to 34 cohort. It degrades significantly in 35 to 45, which happens to be where your target acquisition's current user base is concentrated. He looked at Marcus without any particular expression. It changes the retention modeling on page 3. David Marlowe, who had said nothing for 40 minutes, turned his head fractionally toward the Australian at the far end of the table. Marcus did not like silences he had not created. He smiled and said, with the specific tone of a man managing an inconvenience, "Thank you for that. We're happy to address detailed data questions in the due diligence phase. For this evening, perhaps it would be more productive to." "I'd actually like to hear more about the cohort issue," Caulfield interrupted. He was looking directly at C. Harrow. "You glanced at the document for less than a minute." "I've seen the underlying numbers before," C. Harrow said. "Different context." That was all he said. He set the notebook flat on the table and looked at Caulfield with the calm, unself-conscious patience of someone who knows the next question will come when it's ready. But here's where it stops being a routine disagreement. Because Marcus Dray, a man who had humiliated junior analysts in front of clients, who had once reduced a 32-year-old associate to tears in the middle of a partner meeting over a rounding error, who had built his reputation on never being challenged from below, Marcus Dray looked at the worn boots and the olive jacket and made the worst decision of his professional life. He straightened his cuffs. He looked at C. Harrow from across the mahogany table and said clearly enough for every person in the room to hear, "Mr. Harrow, I appreciate the enthusiasm, but I want to be direct. This is a boardroom, not a seminar. The gentlemen around this table have managed more capital than most academic institutions will ever see in their lifetimes. They don't need commentary from someone who showed up to a $400 million meeting in a jacket from a camping store." Nadia Reeves stopped moving entirely. Garrett Holt went very slightly still. Raymond Caulfield looked at the tablecloth. David Marlowe did not look anywhere. He simply stopped the way a machine stops when a critical process fails. C. Harrow looked at Marcus Dray, not with anger, nothing like anger, with that same quality of patient attention. He set down his glass of scotch very slowly, and the soft sound of it finding the table was the loudest thing in the room for a long moment. "Okay," he said, "that was all." He opened his notebook again and wrote something at the top of the page. He did not look at Marcus. Marcus waited for a protest, an apology, a visible display of wounded dignity he could dismiss. Nothing came. The absence of it seemed to irritate him more than an argument would have. He buttoned his jacket with one sharp movement and turned back to the center of the table. "I'm also going to recommend to Mr. Holt that the co-investment position held through the Australian holding structure be reviewed before we proceed further," Marcus said, his voice level and deliberate, carrying cleanly to every corner of the room. "Passive capital is passive capital. We appreciate the participation. We don't require the editorial." Garrett Holt said nothing. He was looking at the window. Nadia Reeves, by the east wall, set down the decanter she had been holding for the past 90 seconds without realizing it. C. Harrow still did not look up from his notebook. He wrote one more line, then he closed it. The room moved on, or appeared to. Marcus resumed the presentation, the same fluent, confident forward motion, now carrying a fresh edge of authority from having dealt with the disruption cleanly. Caulfield accepted a refill of his glass. Marlowe adjusted the documents in front of him. For approximately 4 minutes, the evening appeared to have corrected itself. The man at the far end of the table had accepted his position, absorbed his warning, and gone quiet. Marcus Dre had managed a difficult moment, and the room had returned to its intended shape. Nadia watched C. Harrow's hands. They were resting flat on the closed notebook, completely still. That was the thing she kept coming back to. Not the notebook. The stillness. It didn't look like defeat. It looked like a person who has already decided what comes next and is simply waiting for the right moment to begin. She didn't know why that distinction mattered to her. But it did. Then Caulfield turned one page of his document, then turned back. He did this twice, the way a person does when a number stops agreeing with the number next to it. He set both hands flat on the table and said quietly, "I'd like to hear from Mr. Harrow, please." The second silence was longer than the first. Marcus opened his mouth. Holt, from the head of the table, made a very small gesture, almost imperceptible, the movement of 2 fingers, and Marcus closed his mouth again. C. Harrow looked up from his notebook. Something passed across his face, not triumph, not even satisfaction, something closer to the particular tiredness of someone who has waited a long time for a question and is now ready to answer it properly. He leaned forward, both forearms on the table, and spoke with the unhurried clarity of a man who has explained complicated things many times and learned that the key is always to start with what is actually true. The model works if your assumption about user demographics holds, he said, looking at Caulfield. It doesn't hold. The 3 companies in this merger have a combined active user base where approximately 61% of revenue-generating subscribers fall in the 35 to 45 bracket. That's the cohort where premium willingness to pay degrades, which means the retention projections on page 3 are overstated by somewhere between 30 and 40%, which means the valuation multiple on the lead acquisition needs to come down. How far down? Caulfield asked. That depends on what you think the ceiling is on younger cohort expansion. If you can grow 25 to 34 users by 20% year over year, the model starts to work again. If growth in that cohort stays where it is, you're looking at a valuation carrying about $80 to $90 million in optimistic air. 80 to 90 million. The number sat in the room and didn't move. You have experience with subscription wellness platforms specifically? David Marlowe asked. It was the first thing he had said all evening. Some, C. Harrow said. Quantify some, Marlowe said. C. Harrow was quiet for a moment, not hesitant, but deciding. He opened his notebook to the page he had written on after Marcus's remark. He turned it around and slid it toward Marlowe and Caulfield. On the page, in a clear and practiced hand, were 5 lines of figures. Not extrapolations, not projections, the kind of precise operational metrics people write down when they are recalling numbers they already know by memory. Caulfield looked at the notebook for a long moment. The room was completely silent. The distant sound of the elevator cable behind the west wall was suddenly audible, a low mechanical hum that none of them had noticed before. Nadia noticed it. She noticed Garrett Holt's jaw and the way it had tightened on the left side. Then Caulfield looked up at C. Harrow. "These are Center's actual numbers," he said, almost to himself. Center was a fitness and wellness platform that had been sold to a private equity consortium in 2022 for a valuation the industry had considered aggressive at the time. The deal had been closely tracked. The numbers had never been publicly released. "How do you know Center's actual numbers?" "Because I built it," C. Harrow said. The room did not erupt. It went the other direction. It contracted, the way a room does when the air pressure changes and every person in it recalibrates simultaneously. Garrett Holt set down his glass with exaggerated care. David Marlowe, for the first time all evening, let out a slow breath through his nose. Marcus Dre's face underwent a rapid and terrible series of adjustments. Surprise collapsing into calculation, calculation collapsing into something that had no professional name, and ultimately arrived at nothing at all because his face had simply run out of moves. Here is something that almost no one outside of a tight circle in Sydney and Melbourne knew at the time. In the spring of 2016, after a period of sustained overwork that had quietly hollowed him out in ways that only became visible in retrospect, Chris Hemsworth sat alone in a rented house on the edge of Byron Bay and made a decision. Not a dramatic decision, not the kind people make in movies. A quiet one. He had been thinking for months about what it actually meant to be well. Not just fit, not just functional, but genuinely well. The physiology of it, the behavioral science behind it, the gap between what the fitness industry was selling and what the research actually supported. He had no background in tech. He had no background in business development at any meaningful scale. What he had was a particular quality of sustained attention that he had spent years applying to physical performance and a growing conviction that the information people needed was being buried under marketing. He put a significant amount of his own capital into the idea and spent the next 3 years working with a small team: exercise scientists, behavioral health specialists, nutritionists, engineers, building something that reflected what the evidence actually said. He kept his involvement quiet because he didn't want the product shaped by his name. He wanted it shaped by whether it worked. He still carries on the inner cover of the notebook he brings to every meeting a single handwritten line from the research scientist who first convinced him the project was viable. It reads, "The data doesn't care what you're famous for, neither does he." He reached into the inside pocket of the olive canvas jacket and placed a single card on the table. He slid it toward Marcus Dre specifically. It was a plain card, no logo, just a name and a series of company registration numbers in a small, clean font. Christopher Harrow. Harrow Holdings Limited, ABN 47-212-408-019. Beneath it, it's in smaller text, majority silent, co-investor, High Post Capital Consortium. Center platform founding 2016, divestment 2022. Marcus picked up the card. He read it. He set it down. He picked it up again. The High Post connection was something Apex's legal team had known in the abstract, a silent co-investor in their current acquisition target. Represented it through a holding company structure, holding a position large enough to require inclusion at the table, but small enough that Apex's team had never looked closely at who was behind it. They had looked at the numbers. They had not looked at the person. And that was not the only thing they hadn't looked at closely enough. Because over the course of the next 40 minutes, 3 other people in that building, people who had worked directly with Marcus Dre over the past 4 years, were going to say things that none of them had been prepared to say until tonight. The first was a woman named Claire Ashworth. She was 38, a former Apex senior analyst who had left the firm 14 months earlier, and she was currently working 2 floors below in the Harrington's Private Business Center, finishing a report for a competing fund that had been quietly tracking the same merger. She had not known C. Harrow would be in the room tonight. She had not known any of this was happening above her head. But when Nadia Reeves, who had slipped out to the service corridor at 9:15 p.m. and heard enough through the oak door to understand what was unfolding, came downstairs and found her and said simply, "There is someone upstairs I think you would want to speak to." Claire Ashworth closed her laptop without hesitation. Because Marcus Dre had ended her career at Apex in the autumn of 2023 by publicly attributing her analysis to someone else. The analysis was a retention model she had spent 11 weeks building, the most rigorous work of her professional life, and he had presented it in a partner meeting with 14 people present under the name of a junior associate he was mentoring. And when she raised it afterward in writing, he had told her the discrepancy was a matter of recollection, not record, and that her tone in the email was concerning. She had resigned within the month. She had the original timestamp drafts on a personal hard drive. She had been carrying them for 14 months, waiting without quite knowing what she was waiting for. The second was a man named Patrick Gould, 31, a former Apex associate dismissed in March of the previous year. His termination letter cited performance issues. The actual reason, which 2 other associates had witnessed and said nothing about, each fearing the same outcome, was that Patrick had questioned Marcus Dre's valuation methodology on a healthcare deal during an internal review session. He had been correct. The deal had subsequently underperformed by 31% against projection in its first year. Marcus had filed the performance review that ended Patrick's contract 4 days after that session, using language precise enough to be deniable and damaging enough to follow Patrick into every subsequent job reference. Patrick now worked for a smaller advisory firm in Milwaukee. He drove down on a Thursday night when Nadia called him, arriving at the Harrington at 10:02 p.m. He had brought documentation. He had been bringing it everywhere for 8 months, in a manila envelope at the bottom of his laptop bag, against the possibility that someday it would be useful. The third was Nadia Reeves herself. She had worked the 47th floor for 2 years, and in that time she had seen Marcus Dre conduct 3 separate Apex events in the Penthouse suite. At the second of those events, in February of this year, she had watched him berate a junior catering employee, a 24-year-old named Jesse, who had accidentally poured still water instead of sparkling in a way that was not a quiet, professional correction. It had been sustained, personal, and contemptuous. 4 minutes and 11 seconds by Nadia's count, because she had counted. The sound had carried through the oak door and into the corridor, where 2 other staff members had stood frozen, not knowing whether to enter. Jesse had excused himself to the service bathroom afterward, and Nadia had found him sitting on the floor, not quite crying, not quite okay, staring at the tiles. She had written it down that night in her work log, February 7th, 8:43 p.m., Event 7A, Apex Venture Capital. She had not reported it at the time because Marcus Dre was the client, and Jesse had asked her not to, and she had been afraid of what it would cost her. She was speaking now because Jesse had since left hospitality entirely and was studying accounting at a community college in Evanston, and she no longer saw any point in protecting someone who had never protected anyone. 3 accounts, 3 separate incidents, documented, time-stamped, witnessed. A pattern, not an episode. Garrett Holt heard all of it. He sat at the head of the table and he listened with the practiced stillness of a man processing something expensive. And when it was over, he asked one question. He looked at Marcus Dre and said, "Did you know who he was when you seated him at the far end of the table?" Marcus said, "The legal team said the identity was confidential." "That's not what I asked," Holt said. Marcus did not answer. That was in its way an answer. What happened to Marcus Dre happened the way most institutional reckoning happens, not in a dramatic scene, but in a sequence of quiet administrative events that added up to something final. Garrett Holt called him into a side meeting room at 11:15 p.m. after the investors had dispersed to their suites, and the conversation lasted 11 minutes. Marcus's security pass for the Apex offices was deactivated at 8 a.m. the following morning. The formal termination letter, citing conduct unbecoming a senior representative of the firm, a material failure of client due diligence, and a documented pattern of conduct incompatible with Apex's stated professional standards, referencing Section 12. 4 of his employment contract was delivered to his personal email at 9:47 a.m. Thursday, the 22nd of October. He read it sitting in the lobby of a hotel 3 blocks from his apartment, having already been denied access to the building where he had spent 9 years building what he believed was an unassailable position. The Apex board issued a restructuring announcement the following Monday. It did not name Marcus Dre. It did not need to. But that was only the beginning of what happened to the people who had built the room that way in the first place. Claire Ashworth's time-stamped analysis, the 11-week retention model, was submitted to Apex's internal ethics committee by the end of that week. The committee, now acutely aware of its regulatory exposure, engaged outside counsel from Brennan and Whitfield LLP to conduct an independent review of attribution practices across 7 deals in which Marcus Dre had been the lead. By the 14th of November, the review had expanded to 11 deals. Claire was invited to serve as a paid consultant to the process. Her billable rate was $380 per hour. She accepted without negotiation. Patrick Gould's documentation of the March dismissal was reviewed by the same counsel. The healthcare deal that had underperformed by 31% was flagged for separate examination. Two limited partners in that fund had formally requested a written explanation for the valuation discrepancy by the end of November. The fund's general counsel sent responses that were, by general assessment, unsatisfying. A class action filing was being prepared by Patterson & Oaks LLP on behalf of 4 affected investors, citing the specific March review session and the documented suppression of contrary analysis. The filing named Apex Venture Capital as the primary respondent. On the 12th of November, a finance publication ran a piece under the headline, Apex's $400 M Wellness Bet, a culture problem 3 years in the making. The piece did not name C. Harrow. It named Marcus Dre in connection with the termination and the ongoing ethics review, with enough specificity that anyone who had attended the October dinner or worked at Apex in the previous 4 years understood exactly what had happened and why. The piece was shared 19,000 times in the first 60 hours. 2 Apex limited partners withdrew committed capital, a combined total of $37 million, and redirected it to a competing fund before the end of the month. Garrett Holt issued a public statement on the 15th. It acknowledged the review, reaffirmed the firm's commitment to professional standards, and expressed regret for the manner in which certain matters were handled during a period of rapid organizational growth. The statement had been drafted by a public relations firm. It was read flatly by anyone who understood what it was, and at Apex's current level of visibility, most people who read it understood exactly what it was. Holt's name appeared in the headline of a follow-up piece on the 22nd of November. He did not issue a further statement. His assistant replied to press inquiries with a single sentence, Mr. Holt is focused on the firm's ongoing restructuring. He was also, as of the second week of December, in conversations with the firm's founding limited partners about the terms of a potential transition of the managing partner role. Those conversations were, at his insistence, confidential. They did not remain so. As for the deal itself, it closed on the 14th of November with the corrected valuation and a substantially renegotiated indemnification structure that reflected the actual demographic data, not the optimistic version that had been presented in the Penthouse suite 3 weeks earlier. Raymond Caulfield committed his fund's position 3 days after the dinner. He called his senior partner from the black German sedan on the way back to his hotel that night and said, only, we need to revisit the model before we sign anything with anyone else. David Marlowe's office sent a formal letter of intent the following week. His personal note attached to the letter contained one sentence, please extend our regards to Mr. Harrow. The FTC matter was disclosed by the acquisition target's legal team, addressed through a formal consent agreement, and resolved within 60 days without affecting the deal's core structure. The combined entity moved forward with a retention strategy weighted toward the 25 to 34 demographic. The first quarterly report published in January showed a 17% improvement in new subscriber acquisition in that cohort, 3% below the most optimistic projection, 14% above what the original Apex model had forecast. C. Harrow's holding company retained its co-investment position. Its value appreciated accordingly. He did not issue a statement about any of it. On the last Thursday of November, Nadia Reeves was setting up a smaller private event on the 43rd floor, a board dinner, 12 people, simple by the Harrington standards, when she heard the service elevator open behind her. She turned, expecting a delivery from the kitchen. It was C. Harrow. He was wearing the same olive jacket. He was carrying 2 takeaway coffees from the cafe 3 blocks south, the one that stayed open until midnight, and used whole milk without being asked. Still working the Harrington? He said. I am, she said. He held out one of the coffees. He didn't explain why he had brought 2. He had just brought 2. You spotted something was off the moment I stepped off that elevator, and what you told them about Jesse's, about February 7th, that took something most people don't have. They had been waiting a long time for someone to say it out loud. She looked at the cup in her hand. It was still warm. He's studying accounting now, she said. Jess, he seems like he's going to be okay. Good. C. Harrow was quiet for a moment. The corridor was still. The wind off the lake pressed against the north-facing glass at the end of the hall, a low sound, like someone holding a door open in another room. That's the part that actually matters, he said. Not the deal. Not the numbers. The fact that someone wrote down February 7th and didn't throw it away. He picked up his coffee. He looked at her for a beat with the same quality of attention he had turned on the glass partition 3 weeks earlier. Not assessing, just seeing clearly. Don't apologize for that, he said. Not ever. Then he went through the door toward the 47th floor. Nadia stood in the service corridor for a moment, holding the coffee in both hands, looking at the closed door. The elevator cable hummed faintly behind the west wall. After a moment, she went back to her clipboard, and the Harrington Club went on being exactly what it had always been. A place where enormous amounts of money moved quietly between rooms, except that now Nadia Reeves knew something about it that she hadn't known before. That even in rooms like that, the people who actually change things are rarely the ones at the head of the table. There is a particular kind of arrogance that confuses appearance for evidence. It mistakes the jacket for the person, the accent for the knowledge, the seat at the far end of the table for the measure of a man's actual weight in the room. It is a very old mistake. And it is always the same mistake, the assumption that dignity is something you earn by dressing correctly, by sitting in the right chair, by belonging to the right group of people who have already decided they belong. It isn't. Dignity is not a credential. It doesn't come with a title or a corner office or a suit that costs more than someone else's rent. Every person in a room carries it. The analyst who built the model, the associate who asked the right question and was punished for it, the catering supervisor who wrote it down and waited, the man at the far end of the table in the worn boots who already knew the ending and was patient enough to let it arrive on its own. Real authority doesn't announce itself. It shows up in a canvas jacket. It sits at the far end. And when someone tries to dismiss it with a cruel word in a room full of powerful people, it doesn't argue. It simply waits. It already knows how the story ends. What do you think? Have you ever been in a room where the most underestimated person turned out to be the one holding all the cards? Let us know your story in the comments below. We read every single one. If this gave you chills, hit the like button and share it with someone who needs to be reminded that real power never needs to announce itself. Subscribe for more stories about what dignity looks like when no one's watching. This is a fictional dramatized story created for educational and inspirational purposes. All supporting characters, businesses, and events are fictional. Any resemblance to real persons other than Chris Hemsworth is coincidental. Narration is AI assisted.